Welcome back to Apologetics. We're wrapping things up tonight. We're actually going to do two lectures tonight. So the first one is going to be on divine determinism and human freedom. And then the second one is going to be on the problem of religious language. So we'll do it in two parts. This is where we're at in the class outline. We've worked our way to the bottom now, where we're just covering the appendixes. So tonight we'll be doing appendixes 2 and 3. But we'll do these in two parts, so we'll film them separately and then put them up separately as well. Okay, this issue then, the one we're going to start with, human freedom versus divine determinism, we're not looking at it as theologians per se, to try to understand that. I mean, that's a fascinating subject in and of itself, right? To try to understand how God's sovereignty and human freedom, if there is such a thing, work together, right? But this, when I'm presenting it tonight in this lecture, that's not necessarily the problem that we're looking at, how these two things go together. Instead, and the reason it fits into apologetics, is this problem of divine determinism and human freedom is actually a criticism of Christianity, or theism in general, I guess you could say, of non-Christians, non-theists, and they're accusing us, or accusing our beliefs, our beliefs in theism, God, Christianity, of a contradiction. And so we're defending ourselves from that attack, if you will. So let me explain more what I mean by that. It's, in a sense, it's very similar to the problem of evil. So if you think about it, when we discussed the problem of evil way back in the first section of the class about the existence of God, the problem of evil was something that the non-theist was bringing to us as a rejection or as a reason to reject theism. And so we try to develop defenses and theodicies to the problem of evil. Similarly, this would be a problem that an atheist would bring, and many have, to theists as a reason to reject the existence of God. So if we would go back and put it in the normal outline of the class, it would fit in the first section next to the problem of evil. But since it's not as popular of a reason to reject theism, and because some students taking this class weren't required to be responsible for this material, I put it towards the end as an appendix. It's not as common as the problem of evil, but I have encountered it, even when I've just been out talking to people and encouraging them to trust in Jesus Christ as their Savior. I've had people bring this issue up, and so it is something worthy to discuss, even for our own purposes, so that we can best understand it, but then also to try to help others, either Christians who are troubled by this issue or non-Christians who are maybe rejecting Christianity or theism because of this issue. Many have made this argument against theism, but probably the most well-known version of it is by Nelson Pike. So you can do a search online for Nelson Pike's version of the problem of free will. But I'll try to summarize it for you here quickly on this slide. So basically it goes like this. I'm summarizing Nelson Pike's argument here. But this is how he and others would communicate it. So if God exists, right, he would have infallible foreknowledge. That's most theists' understanding of God, that God is omniscient, and part of that omniscience is that he knows the future perfectly, infallibly, can't be wrong about the future. So that's premise one. Premise two if God has infallible foreknowledge, then we can't have free will. And, you have to think through that premise a little bit. We will. We'll walk through this, of course, premise by premise. But the thinking here, let me just try to explain the thinking behind this premise. Basically, the thinking behind it is that if God foreknows what we are going to do, then we have to do it. In other words, we can't do otherwise. And we'll use some examples. The most famous one is Jones going to mow his lawn tomorrow or not? So if God infallibly foreknows that tomorrow Jones is going to mow his lawn tomorrow, well, then when tomorrow arrives, there's a sense in which Jones has to mow his lawn. Because if he wouldn't, then God's foreknowledge would have been incorrect. And so there's a sense in which, according to this premise at least, Jones wouldn't be free because he couldn't do otherwise. He couldn't not mow. And if you can't do otherwise, according to this premise, then Jones doesn't have free will. Premise 3, we do in fact have free will. So Nelson Pike, or an atheist, would have to defend this premise and argue that we do have free will. And then the conclusion, of course, then, is that God does not exist. So you see, the atheist is trying to draw out an internal contradiction to our belief system. And as I'm sure you're aware, when a belief system or a belief has contradictions within it, well, that's fairly good evidence, fairly good reason to reject those beliefs, because contradictory things can't be true. So that's what's being attempted here, and then it's our job to respond to this argument. It's important whenever you're responding to an argument that you identify the premise which you're going to attack or disagree with, right? So what I would encourage you to do, if you haven't done this already, if you're taking notes, write out this argument quickly. Write out the whole thing, everything that I have on the screen. You don't have to write this out, but write out the premises and the conclusion. 1, 2, 3, 4. Write that out on a piece of paper or type it up somewhere where you can access it. Because as we'll go through, there's various responses to this argument. So go ahead, even those taking it here in the room, go ahead and write it out. There's various responses to this argument, and we're going to see the different responses will attack different premises or disagree with different premises here. And for each response, I will tell you what premise that response is attacking, but to have the argument in front of you the whole time will help you remember which premise it is and how it fits into the argument. Okay? So I believe, if I remember right, we're going to look at 5 different responses to this argument. And these responses are by theists who are defending their belief in the existence of God from this argument. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to write all the premises down now, and we'll move on to the first response. And the first response is called Open Theism. Open Theism. Now you might be familiar with Open Theism as a theological position, and it would be similar to this. So there's a sense in which, in this response, an open theist is using their theological position to respond to the problem. So the open theist's response to this issue. The open theist would reject premise 1. Premise 1 is, if God exists, then he has infallible foreknowledge. So the open theist just rejects that. You might be familiar with open theism. Someone who's an open theist doesn't believe that God has foreknowledge of future free human choices, okay? So an open theist just rejects premise one. And in that sense, it does respond to the argument because it rejects the first premise. The open theist agrees with premise two that if God did have infallible foreknowledge of our free human choices, then they really wouldn't be free. So the open theist accepts premise two, and the open theist accepts premise three. The open theist would affirm that we have free will. So the open theist is going to reject premise one. I'll give you some examples of open theists throughout history and some contemporary ones. John Calvin's nephew, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Socinus, possibly, Socinus. He held this position, even if he didn't call it open theism. The well-known philosophy professor at Oxford, Richard Swinburne, would hold this position. Clark Pinnock, William Hasker, who's done a lot of good work in the Trinity, but William Hasker would affirm open theism. And then Robert Audi, who is a Christian philosophy professor at Notre Dame. Used to be a philosophy professor at the University of Nebraska here in Lincoln for 30 years, but now is at Notre Dame. All of those individuals would affirm open theism and this sort of response to this problem. There is disagreement among open theists as to why God doesn't know the future free human choices. Some open theists would say that God could know future free human choices, but he just chooses not to. In other words, God refrains from knowing those things. He chooses not to know those things. He could. So these sort of open theists would say, look, God is omniscient. God could know those things if he wanted to. He just chooses, if you will, not to look into the future to see these things. And they would say something like this. They would say, look, it's similar with omnipotence, right? Omnipotence is the belief or the attribute of God that God can do anything that's logically possible. But just because God can do anything logically possible, it doesn't mean he has to do everything that's logically possible, right? So for example, he could have made the earth 1,000,000 times bigger than it is. He could have done that, but he didn't have to. In fact, it seems like he chose not to do that. So God chose not to do something that he could have done if he wanted to. And so these sort of open theists would say the same thing about God's omniscience, that he could know everything, including future free human choices, but he just chooses not to in order to preserve our free will. Other open theists say, no, the reason why God doesn't know future free human choices is that it's impossible to. In fact, they would say it's logically impossible, and that's why God can't do it. So they would affirm, these open theists, they would, at least according to them, still affirm God's omnipotence, still affirm God's omniscience, but they would just say, like creating a square circle, it's logically impossible. It's also logically impossible for God to know future free human choices. God can't do it because it's a logical impossibility. They would just say that those choices don't exist yet, so it would be impossible for even an infinite being, an omniscient being, to know things that don't exist yet. At least that would be their thought process. That would be their reasoning about why God doesn't know future free human choices yet, because they don't exist yet. They haven't happened yet. So there's nothing there to give them truth value. If you know more about the idea of philosophical ideas of truth and what gives something truth value or not. They would just say there's no truth value that exists, and so God couldn't know those truths because there's nothing to give those propositions truth value. So these type of open theists would say that they're not disagreeing with the classical theists' view of omniscience, because they're affirming that God knows everything that's logically possible to know. They're just disagreeing on how to define what facts are that can logically be known. And they would claim that future decisions of free will creatures aren't actual facts that could logically be known. So we might want to think through some of the problems with this position. And we're going to do this for all 5 responses, right? I'm going to lay out the response as objectively as I can, just explaining it so you understand it. But then I will come back and point out some of the problems with all 5 of the responses, because none of the responses are airtight, right? They all have some issues. So what are some issues with this response? Well, I think one problem we could point out is that this response technically is heresy. So that might sound worse than it really is. Heresy is one of those words that's thrown around. It's a churchy word, right? But all that technically means is that it's a belief that is well outside traditional, normal Christian beliefs, right, throughout history. So if something is heretical, that falls way outside the boundary of traditional historical Christian beliefs, right? So, even when Christians disagree with themselves, like Lutherans and Presbyterians disagree with each other on more secondary issues, if you will, they don't really accuse each other of heresy. But if there would be a denomination, and there are, of course, that make claims that are way outside the boundary of traditional historic Christianity, then they're considered heretical beliefs. And that was a term used more in olden days than it is today. Some people throw that around really loosely, and they shouldn't, right? So you probably know people who, well, according to them, anybody who disagrees with them about anything is a heretic, and we don't want to use the term that loosely. My point here is that technically open theism is a heresy. So it seems to be one of those positions that is pretty far outside the boundary of most doctrinal statements. So especially evangelical doctrinal statements, most all of them would reject open theism as being unbiblical. And it just seems, as you're probably aware of, it just seems that there's many, many verses in the Bible that talk about God having foreknowledge, even of free human choices. So it seems to me that the open theist is in a very difficult position to try to reconcile their open theism with the Bible, with Scripture. It might be a position they come to philosophically, but when you come up with a philosophical position as a Christian, you would want to compare your philosophical conclusions with what Scripture says, and if it contradicts, well, then that's a fairly good clue that your philosophical reasoning has gone awry somewhere. Okay? And that's what I would say has happened here. That even if we don't understand how God can have infallible foreknowledge of free future human decisions, it seems like according to Scripture, he surely does. And I, for one, would be very, very uncomfortable with denying that. So I would reject open theism as a legitimate response to this issue. But I wanted you to be aware of it for several reasons, and it's also a response, the open theistic response. It's also a very common response for the problem of evil, as I'm sure you can imagine. So we even had Robert Audi talk about the problem of evil at the University of Nebraska here recently through our Ratio Christi ministry, And he brought up open theism as a response to the problem of evil as well. And I'm sure you can see how that might play out. But again, I would reject open theism theologically, and so I would not recommend using it for the problem of evil or the problem of free will here. Okay, let's move on to the second response, and this is just the idea that God is timeless. So, the timelessness of God. This position would also reject premise 1. So go back to the argument that you have written down. This position or this response would reject premise 1. Premise 1 being, if God exists, then he has infallible foreknowledge. Now they reject premise 1 for different reasons that the open theists reject premise 1. And I'll explain that here in a minute. But I'll say that this response agrees with premise 2. So they agree that if God did have infallible foreknowledge, then our decisions wouldn't be free. And this response would also affirm premise 3, that we have free will. So to help you better understand this response, the person who takes this response, that God is timeless, is going to make the point that Pike's argument only really works if God is in time. And so to speak, looks down the tunnel of time to see future human decisions. But according to this position, God exists outside of time, so technically he's not looking down time. In other words, he doesn't have foreknowledge. God just has immediate knowledge of all things on the timeline, if you will. And I'll explain that more a little bit as we go on. But let me first mention some proponents of this position. So none other than Thomas Aquinas would affirm this position, God's timelessness, and then of course all Thomists would usually use this position to respond to the problem of free will. Anselm, another well-known theologian from history, and then some more moderate or more modern theologians would be like Eleanor Stump and Kretzmann. There's a well-known article by Stump and Kretzmann that talk about this. So how is it that God's timelessness gets us off the hook here? Well, according to folks like this, Aquinas, Anselm, Stump, God is outside of time, and therefore he and his knowledge is timeless. So if you think about that for a moment, and I know it's hard to conceptualize, a timeless being, but just try to simplify it in your mind for a moment. If God is outside of time, then his knowledge technically doesn't occur before the events. So it's not as though he has knowledge before the events, because God's not in time to have things before or after. Both him, God, and his knowledge are eternal. They're timeless. So there is no foreknowledge going on. From God's perspective, all of history has already played out. And one person I think has used this, well, many people have used this as an example, but I think it's helpful. It's not as though God is looking down a tunnel of time to see what happens. According to this position, if God is timeless, it's more like God is on top of a mountain, and time is the people or the things around the mountain. And so God can look down from the top of the mountain all at once and see everything in time immediately. Whereas those in time, right, those around the mountain can just see, right behind them or right in front of them. God looks down, if you will. The analogy breaks down ultimately, of course, but I think it helps you conceptualize a little bit if God is timeless, how he is viewing things that happen within time. He sees it happening all at once. In his eternal present, God doesn't have a before or after. He's eternally present. He's timeless. And that's why it's not appropriate to say that God has foreknowledge, because he transcends time. One of the things that this response points out, and I think this is critical, and we'll see this in a couple of the different responses, but first of all here, with the timelessness response, is this very, very important distinction between knowing something and causing something. And one of the reasons why I appreciate this response is that it makes this careful distinction. In other words, they're saying that just because God knows something, that doesn't necessarily mean that he caused it. In other words, foreknowledge doesn't equal forecausation. You can know something without causing it. A simple example would just be knowing something of the past. I mean, even we know things of the past, right? So I know that at one particular time, let's say the Nebraska Huskers won a football game. They have won. Not as much recently, but they have won football games, right? And I have knowledge of that past. But my knowledge of the past has no causal effects on whether they won or lost that game, right? Me knowing it doesn't have any causal effects whatsoever. And theoretically, let's say if I knew something about the future, that they would win their first game in the upcoming season, that could be known. Let's say somehow I knew that, or God told that to me. We'll take God out of the picture for now. Let's just say as a being, somehow I knew that. That wouldn't have any causal effects, me knowing the future. So similarly, what this position would say is that God knowing these things about the future from our perspective, not future from God's perspective because he sees everything at once, but God knowing what's going to happen. It's hard to not use time. God knowing these things from our perspective ahead of time has no causal effect on their choices. So I think that's just an important distinction to make, and we'll see other responses use this distinction. But these folks, those who affirm this response, can certainly use that. We'll see some responses who disagree with that, actually. Okay, let's talk through some of the problems with this position. Well, first of all, as you've probably already noticed, timelessness is a difficult concept, right? It's hard to conceptualize. It's hard to talk about. It can be hard to defend. In fact, the atheist might say, look, you're trying to respond to my argument with something that is even more difficult to defend. You're trying to defend yourself from this argument by bringing in something that's even more difficult. So they would say timelessness is a bigger problem for you Christians or you theists than free will is. This idea that God is timeless seems to be incoherent. So that might be a problem with this response. Others would say, look, this seems to make God a bit too passive. And I'm not playing my cards yet. I mean, those of you who know me probably know which position of these five that I would affirm, but I'm doing my best to try to stay objective and just tell you how different people would see problems with these different positions. So one criticism, not necessarily by me, but by some others of this position would be that it makes God too passive, that God doesn't act in history, he just passively knows these things, what people do. And so some people are concerned by this position that God It doesn't make God as sovereign as they think Scripture makes God out to be. It seems that this response or this position makes God not sovereign enough, too passive in the events of history, that he just knows them, but he doesn't have any really say or cause in them. Another problem that some people might point out with this position, not necessarily me, but some people might point out and say, look, it seems kind of silly to say that everything happens at once for God. So if God experiences everything in the same moment, the same timeless moment, God experiences everything at once, which is even hard for us to fathom, then does it really make sense to say that Hitler's suicide and Jesus' birth happened at the same time? For God? It just seems to cause all sorts of these time issues and problems. And we'd have to say that for God, Jesus' birth and Hitler's suicide happened at the same moment, which it does seem kind of odd to say that. And lastly, another criticism of this position is that you can redo Pike's argument. You can redo it by and include a timeless being, a God. So you can we're not going to take the time to do it here, but you could probably imagine how you could redo the argument and just include a timeless being, a timeless God. And so how you could do that is you could recast Pike's argument and take this timeless being and have him enter time and give that information to, let's say, a prophet. Or if God steps into time, which we think as Christians he does, according to Scripture, steps into time and tells prophets, other human beings, what's going to happen into the future. But as soon as you have God stepping into time, even just in terms of communicating in time, God himself doesn't step into time, according to this position, but he does step into time in the sense of communicating things to people at a particular time, then the problem starts all over again. Or then you're back to square one, basically. Because now you have the same thing where you have God's infallible knowledge being communicated before events happen. So you can rework the argument and include a timeless God, and you're back to square one. Okay, let's move on to number 3. Sometimes this is referred to as Okhamism, after William of Ockham. You might have heard of Occam's razor before. It's kind of a rule of thumb when you're trying to figure out what happened. I'm oversimplifying it now, but Occam's razor is the idea of it's all else equal, go with more simpler explanation for something, and that's all else equal, more likely right than a more complex explanation. So Occam's razor is used in all sorts of practices, even science, Occam's razor. But William of Ockham was a well-known Christian theologian and philosopher, and so this response is named after him. Now, Okhamism would reject premise 2 of Pike's argument. So Okhamism would reject premise 2, which says, if God has infallible foreknowledge, then we can't have free will. So this position affirms that God has infallible foreknowledge, and it affirms that we have free will. Human beings make free choices. So basically, this position is just rejecting the idea that if God infallibly foreknows something, a future free human choice, or a future human choice, then that choice can't be free. This position just rejects that, premise 2. An explanation of why they reject that premise is that according to this response, our free choices come first causally, even though they don't come first chronologically in time. So think through that a moment, because this is a little bit difficult conceptually. We're used to causation happening chronologically in time, right? You're playing pool and you hit the white ball and it hits the black ball, and then the black ball goes off in the opposite direction. And so those things happen sequentially, chronologically in time. We're used to causation happening chronologically in time, sequentially. But that wouldn't necessarily have to be how causation works, right? Even though that's how we're most used to causation. And so the Okhmist just says, look, God's foreknowledge is caused by the future free choice. Okay? So let's go back to the example of Jones mowing the lawn tomorrow. So tomorrow, God knows that Jones is going to mow the lawn. And God knows that infallibly. But what has caused God to have that foreknowledge is Jones's free choice, even though he hasn't made it yet. So, for example, if Jones would have chosen, kind of stand back from it all, if Jones would have chosen not to mow, then that's what God would have known from all eternity past. So it was the free choices that caused God's knowledge, not vice versa. And that's what the Okhmist would say Pike has gotten wrong, that he's confused the causation effect. Pike's argument is assuming that God's foreknowledge was causing Jones to make the choices that he did. And the Okhmist is just saying, no, you've got it exactly backwards. It's Jones's future decisions, even though they haven't been made yet in time, that has caused God's foreknowledge in the past. So in that sense, in this situation, causation is happening backwards in time. But the Okhmist would say that that's not a problem. Whatever Jones decides about mowing tomorrow, God knew that from all eternity, because God's knowledge was caused by Jones's decision. Now, I will say that most Okhmists do believe that God is timeless. So some of these other positions that we're going to look at agree that God is timeless. Maybe even an open theist would agree that God is timeless. It's just that, for example, an Okhmist wouldn't think that God's timelessness solves the problem. So they're not necessarily denying that God is timeless. They're just saying that God's timelessness doesn't really solve this particular problem, the problem of free will. But they would say this response does, the Okhmist response. So some well-known Okhmists, of course, William of Ockham, because it's named after him. Some contemporary Christian philosophers would be like Robert Adams and Alvin Plantinga. Early in his career, he would affirm Okhamism as a solution to this problem. So the Okhmist, again, believes that Jones does have free will. He has the power to do otherwise. Jones has the power to mow or not mow, to make that decision. He has free will. So if he doesn't mow, then God would have believed that about the future all along. So God's foreknowledge of future human choices is dependent upon what we will choose to do. The decisions, the choices come first causally, even though they don't come first chronologically. Jones's decision to mow caused God's foreknowledge, not vice versa. Let's talk about some of the problems with this position. Some people, not necessarily me, I'm not trying to play my cards yet and show you my concerns with these different positions. I'm trying to be as objective as possible and just share with you some problems that some people have with these positions. So some people would say, don't like this response because it seems to imply that God learns things. And if you have information coming from outside of God to God, causing God's knowledge, then it seems like God is learning things, or that God doesn't know something, but then does acquire that knowledge from the outside, from somebody, another being causing that information. So some people reject this position because it seems like it implies that God learns things. And it would seem to be, that would seem to violate his omniscience. If information comes from outside of God, he learns things. Some people would reject this position, again, because they don't think it makes God sovereign enough. Some people have an understanding of sovereignty such that they would say, this makes God too passive. God does more than just know the future. He has a causal impact on the future. And they would reject this position because it makes God too passive, not in control of the future enough, if you will. I mean, somebody raising that objection might say something like, how could God make sure his plan for the universe gets fulfilled? If God is just allowing these, free human choices, if you will, and he knows what they're going to be, yes, but he's not having any causal impact on the future, on these free human choices, then how could he control what happens in the future? And according to the Bible, at least, it seems as though, according to these folks, God is more sovereign than that. God has more control over what happens in the future than just knowing about it. So some would be concerned about this position for that reason. And this strong understanding of God's sovereignty is what has led people to the next position we're going to look at. So position number 4 is called Compatibilism. And those who have a very strong understanding of God's sovereignty usually will take this strategy or this response. But before we look at the fourth one, I wanted to show a short video, 3-4 minute video, that summarizes the problem and the first couple of responses that we've looked at so far. I thought it'd be a good time to take a break and watch this video. It's an animated video, so I think it'll help summarize where we've come so far.
The Center for Philosophy of Religion presents Human Freedom and Divine Foreknowledge. If God exists, he is present at every time in history, and he knows everything that can be known at each time. Many people think God's knowledge extends to what will happen in the future. For example, that God knew 1,000 years ago that Carl would climb Mount Baker today. Knowledge requires belief, and so God also believed 1,000 years ago that Carl would climb Mount Baker today. And surely Carl can't now do anything about what God believed way back before he was born. Carl also can't do anything about the fact that God is never, in fact, can't be wrong in what he believes. So, given that God believed before Carl was ever born, that Carl would climb Mount Baker today, and given that God can't be wrong, it seems that Carl doesn't have the power to do anything other than climb Mount Baker today. Genuine freedom, though, would require that Carl possess both the ability to climb and also the ability to refrain from climbing. Thus, it would seem Carl is not free after all. Does God's foreknowledge really conflict with Carl's freedom, and ours in this way. Some think the best way to handle this threat to freedom is to hold that future claims aren't true yet, and so can't be known in advance. Or that God refrains from foreknowing to make room for freedom. Or even that God is outside of time altogether. Alvin Plantinga has argued there is a better solution. Of course, Carl can't change the past, and maybe that's why it seems like God's past beliefs are outside of his control. But not so fast. What would control over God's past beliefs really require? Perhaps just this, that Carl has an ability to do something other than climb, say, to go swimming instead, an ability he won't use, and that God knew in advance he wouldn't use. Yes, but if Carl has an ability, he could have used it. So what would have happened if he had used the ability and stopped climbing to go swimming instead? Well, in that case, God would always have had a different belief. If Carl had refrained from climbing and gone swimming, then 1,000 years ago, God would not have had the belief that Carl would climb today, but would instead have had the belief that he would go swimming today. And, as Plantinga has argued, this removes the threat that God's foreknowledge seems to pose for our free will, without denying that God always knows what we will do in advance. To learn more about these ideas, please visit plantingavideos.com.
So I thought that was well done for a simple, summary animated version. Kind of give us a break and summarize what we've seen so far. Well, let's move on to the fourth response that we're going to cover tonight, and that is, as I said, compatibilism. So the compatibilist position would reject premise 3. If you've written out the Pike's argument from the beginning, premise 3 is that we have free will. And the compatibilist would just say, well, no, we don't have free will. So the compatibilist would affirm that God has infallible foreknowledge, and they would affirm that if God has infallible foreknowledge, then we can't be free. So they would affirm those other premises. The premise that the compatibilist would reject is premise 3, that we have free will. So some well-known proponents of this position would be most Calvinists throughout history. People like John Calvin, Martin Luther, St. Augustine, definitely later in his life, Jonathan Edwards, and a contemporary theologian, pastor, John Piper. So Calvinists, for the most part, would take this response to the problem of free will. They would just basically deny free will. Now, let me clarify what I mean by that. What they're denying here is libertarian free will. And that's what they would point out, is that Pike is assuming. So in Pike's argument, when Pike talks about free will, Pike is assuming libertarian free will, which is oftentimes defined as the ability to choose otherwise. And a compatibilist, Calvinist, would reject that we have that sort of free will. Instead, what they would say is we have a compatibilistic free will. So they would redefine what it means for us to have free will. They would say we don't have libertarian free will, we don't have the ability to choose otherwise, but we do have compatibilistic free will. And I'll explain what they mean by that. Now, this is a debate, as you can imagine, between Christians and even beyond Christians, even in the non-Christian philosophical circles, for different reasons, but between compatibilistic free will and libertarian free will. The libertarian is going to say, look, we need to have this sort of free will, the ability to choose otherwise, in order to be held morally accountable. Because if we don't have this sort of libertarian free will, the ability to choose otherwise, then God couldn't really hold us morally accountable. The compatibilist, on the other hand, says, nah, not so fast. No, it seems that God could hold us morally accountable if we have compatibilist free will. And here's what they mean when they define free will that way. Compatibilist free will is the ability to choose what you want to do. In other words, compatibilist free will is the ability for a person, for you, to choose according to your greatest desire. So if you can choose, if a being or a human being, whatever, Jones, can choose according to his greatest desire, then he is free and can be held morally accountable. So you see how that's a bit different than the ability to choose otherwise. They would not say that we have that ability, but we do have the ability to choose according to our greatest desire. And we can be held morally accountable for choosing according to our greatest desire. That's a compatibilist understanding of free will. And they would just say, look, Pike's argument falls apart when you remove libertarian free will and insert our understanding of free will, the compatibilist understanding of free will. So, what are some problems with this position? What are some issues that people have raised with this position? As you can imagine, many compatibilists come to their position because they want to protect God's sovereignty, right? And most of those who affirm compatibilism, at least within Christian theology, do so because one of their strongest motivations is to protect God's sovereignty, to maintain that God is sovereign in the sense that they understand sovereignty. And so they believe that if we had this libertarian free will that we could choose otherwise, then God wouldn't be sovereign. God would lose control of the universe, so to speak, if we could choose otherwise. So one of the reasons that they're driven to this understanding of free will is because, according to them, it protects God's sovereignty. Critics would say, look, you compatibilists, you Calvinists, you just have an incorrect understanding of God's sovereignty. God doesn't have to necessarily be the cause of all things to be sovereign over all things. God can still be sovereign, God can still be in control of all things, even down to the most minutiae of detail, even if we have libertarian free will. And there's various explanations of how that might be possible, that libertarians would bring to the table and try to push back lovingly against compatibilists to say that God can still be sovereign in the sense that he's in control of everything, even though we have libertarian free will. Libertarians also, as you can imagine, would push back against the idea that people could be held morally accountable if they had this compatibilist type of free will. Libertarians would say, it doesn't seem that God could really hold people morally accountable for these type of decisions. Well, what they would say is it depends on where these desires came from. Because a compatibilist would be very comfortable saying that God is the cause of these desires. So even, so let's use an example again of somebody being able to choose according to their greatest desire. For a compatibilist, then that would mean that the person is free, can be held morally accountable. Even if God is the one who gave that being those desires. they would still see the person as having compatibilist free will and therefore morally accountable. But I think you can see where the libertarian would call foul here. The libertarian would say, how could someone be held morally accountable if God gave that being those desires and then their choices were determined by those desires that God gave them? And it seems like they are more like a puppet. That, yeah, okay, I guess you can say God isn't causing their choices, but God is causing the desires which cause the choices. So it just seems to remove God as the puppeteer one step back. So they might say God, isn't the puppeteer because he's not causing the choices, but the libertarian would say, no, actually God is the puppeteer because he's causing the desires which cause the choices. So no, you compatibilist, you haven't really protected moral accountability, so to speak. You don't have a situation where humans could be morally accountable if God is the one causing these desires. And at least for some compatibilists, at least for some Calvinists, this puts them in a corner where they have to admit that God is the cause of evil. Now, I'm not saying that all Calvinists would say that. Some refuse that conclusion to their position. They would say, some Calvinists would just say, look, that's where our position seems to lead, but we reject that, and we don't know how God isn't the cause of evil. We just believe he isn't. It's a mystery. We don't understand how God isn't the cause of evil, even though he's the cause of all things. Sometimes they use the term omnicausality, like omniscient or omnibenevolent or omnipotence, omnicausality. God causes all things, but he's not the cause of evil. And that seems contradictory, but we just hold this in tension. It's a mystery for us. Whereas some Calvinists, some compatibilists would just say, no, yep, God is the cause of evil, and that's not really a problem. I don't know how somebody could say that, but there are people who do say that. And so some critics of this position would say, yes, this makes God the author of sin and evil, and so it's not a legitimate response. I will say that most Christians affirm libertarian free will, and to a lot of people who affirm libertarian free will, it's not so much that you can choose otherwise. That might be part of the correct understanding of libertarian free will, but for a lot of libertarians, what's more important is that you are the cause of your choices. Not even necessarily that you can choose otherwise, but that you are a causal agent, that you are the cause of your choices, not your desires, not your DNA, not your genetics, not your nature versus nurture, not God. You are the cause of your choices. You are a causal being, a causal agent. So not even necessarily that you can choose otherwise, although that is a part of the libertarian free will position. But what's more important to most libertarians is that to be morally accountable, you have to be the cause of your choices. In desires, in a sense, right? You have to be a causal agent in order to be held morally accountable. Now, you probably know that I'm not a fan of compatibilism, and I'll talk more about that as we discuss this last issue, or the last response. But I do want to point out that on my website, convincingproof.org, I do have an article where I talk about my concerns with compatibilism, the compatibilist understanding of freedom. The article, if you go to convincingproof.org, the article is just titled, "A Major Flaw in the Compatibilist Understanding of Freedom." Okay, let's move on to the last one, number 5, and that is Molinism. So Molinists would reject premise 2 in Pike's argument. Premise 2 is if God has infallible foreknowledge, then we can't have free will. So the Molinist is going to affirm that God has infallible foreknowledge, and the Molinist is going to affirm that we have free will in the libertarian sense. God's foreknowledge is about what Jones will freely do. So the Molinist rejects premise 2, which says if God has infallible foreknowledge, then we can't have free will. So to defend their position, Molinists use the idea of God's middle knowledge. And I'll explain what Molinists mean by this. But first, some proponents of Molinism would be, of course, in a sense, the originator of it. But even like, Calvinism, is John Calvin really the originator of Calvinism? Well, according to Calvinists, no, because it's just true ideas that maybe Calvin expounded on very well, right? Same thing here with Molinism. Molinists would say it's not as though Molina invented these ideas or even necessarily discovered them, but that he articulated them very well, these truths about God and reality. So it's named after Luis de Molina, who was a theologian during the Reformation era, during the 1500s. He didn't join the Reformation, even though he sympathized with a lot of the reformers. He maintained, he stayed within Roman Catholicism. But that was even, Martin Luther's intention for the vast majority of the time until later in his life as well, that he was trying to reform the church, not start a new one. So though Molina was very sympathetic to the reformers, he never joined them. Other proponents would include William Lane Craig and Alvin Plantinga later in his career. Okay, so how would a Molinist defend their response, defend their position here? Well, as I said, they use this idea of middle knowledge, which I'll explain. So according to Molinism, they summarize God's knowledge in 3 different categories. And some of this is just conceptual. They would agree that God just knows things immediately, that there's not a sequential order of God knowing things. God doesn't know things in chronological order. In fact, most Molinists would say that God is timeless. So there isn't any sort of sequentialism or chronology in God's thought process. But it's helpful for just as human beings within time to think of logical progression of God's knowledge. And certainly there can be logical progression within God, just not chronological progression, if in fact he is timeless, which most Molinists would affirm. So this is, as we talk about these 3 types of knowledge, it's the logical flow of God's knowledge, not the chronological flow. So let's break down these 3 types of knowledge. So according to Molinism, God has what they call natural knowledge, and this is just God's knowledge of things that have to be, okay? So think about it, if we can, of a timeless being before creation, right? This is before God created anything, and if you will, to simplify it, just God's thought process of what he's going to create, and his knowledge of what he's going to create, his knowledge of the future, if you will. So before creation, God would have what Molinists call natural knowledge, and that would be the knowledge of what has to be. So God knows, for example, in any universe he creates, 2 + 2 is going to have to equal 4. That is just a truth of logic that flows from within God's own nature, his rational, logical nature, that he would know that in any universe would have to follow his own rational laws of logic from his own nature. Therefore, any universe, any future that he would create would have to include these sort of logical truths, like 2 + 2 = 4. Same thing about what God knows that he could not do in any universe he would create. God knows, again, because of his own moral nature, that he could never lie or do anything evil. So lying is the easiest example to talk about, but God knows that he will never tell a lie. in any future he could create. Any universe he would create, God would know because of, again, the restriction of his own moral nature, that he could never and would never tell a lie. So this would be God's natural knowledge. True in all possible worlds. Then there's this idea of middle knowledge. And if you will, just from a human standpoint to help us understand these things, this would be God thinking through what different free creatures would choose to do in different circumstances. So in other words, God could be thinking, okay, if I would create Adam, if I would create this human being, Adam, and he would be in a particular situation, then I know, God, talking first person, then I know as God what Adam would choose to do. So for example, God would know something like, okay, if God put me, Adam Johnson, in circumstances in which I was a professional boxer, then God knows in that circumstance I would choose to wear blue boxing shorts. Okay? So that's the type of middle knowledge that we're talking about. God knows that if he would have placed me in the Middle Ages, if he would have had me live in the Middle Ages instead of the 20th century and 21st century, then I would have been a metalsmith. I would have been a worker of metals. I would have chosen that as my profession. So God knows all of those what-ifs, all of those, what philosophers call counterfactuals of free human choices. What free choices free creatures would make in the various circumstances that God could put in them. As you can imagine, these circumstances are almost limitless, right? There's probably an infinite number of circumstances that God could put me in, different times, different professions, different family situations, and God knows the free choices that I would make in any of those circumstances, whether God actualizes those circumstances or not. So I think of it kind of like this. I have a pretty good understanding of my wife. We've been married almost 25 years, and I have a fairly good idea of how she would respond if I brought her flowers tomorrow. Now, I'm not going to bring her flowers tomorrow, but if I did, I have a pretty good idea of how she would respond. But I would think that God, even better so than me, would know. In fact, infallibly, he would know exactly how she would respond if I brought her flowers tomorrow. So God has that sort of counterfactual knowledge, that what-if knowledge. And this is, again, before creation, so God has all of this knowledge as he's thinking through how to create things, or what sort of circumstances he is going to create. He has almost a limitless and infinite number of different possible circumstances for all of us to choose from. But he knows what we would all choose to do and not do in those different circumstances. Okay? And that's what's referred to as God's middle knowledge. As you can imagine then, this results in all sorts of possible worlds that God could create. When I use the word world, I'm not talking about an earth or a planet. I'm talking about a timeline, a universe, if you will. There's probably an infinite amount of universes then, or timelines that God could create, different circumstances that God could create. But he doesn't create all of them, even though he knows what we would choose in all those different circumstances. But out of all of those different circumstances and the different choices we would all make in those different circumstances, he chooses to actualize one of them. He chooses to actually create one of those sets of circumstances, one of those universes. And that's the universe that we're in. That's the timeline that we're in. And then the last category of God's knowledge is his free knowledge. And what Molinists mean by that is the knowledge of what will happen in the actual world he decided to actualize. And this would be what is often referred to as foreknowledge. So his foreknowledge is based on what actually happens, even though he has more than just foreknowledge. He has middle knowledge and natural knowledge. So he uses his middle knowledge to choose. Maybe he chooses, of all the different possible circumstances, he chooses the most optimal one, or the one with the least amount of evil, or the one where the most people go to heaven. I don't know how he chose which one is optimal. But from all the different choices he had from B, from middle knowledge, he chooses one of them to actualize. He does that, creation. And then he has foreknowledge, of course, of everything that's going to happen in that actual world, that actual universe, that actual timeline, that actual circumstances that he does create. He foreknows those things. So God's middle knowledge is his knowledge of what we would freely do. And like the Okhmist, the Molinist would say that God's knowledge of future free human choices is dependent on what we would do with our free will in all possible circumstances. So like the Okhmist, the Molinist would say that God's foreknowledge, free knowledge, C, is caused by our choices. So there's a causal effect. God's foreknowledge is caused by our choices and not vice versa. And this, according to the Molinist, is how God can steer history. This is how God can be in control, be sovereign, if you will, of every single little detail, even down to the minutiae, while still allowing libertarian free will. The circumstances don't cause you to do something. You are the cause of your choices. It's that God would know what you would freely choose in every circumstance, and therefore crafts that particular circumstance to accomplish what he wants to accomplish in history. Not only for you, but for the entire history of the universe, right? History of the timeline that he actualized. So you might say, well, yeah, great, this is a neat idea, maybe some philosopher had at one point in time, but is there any biblical evidence for this idea of middle knowledge? Well, in fact, there is, it seems like. So here's just a couple examples where Jesus seems to refer to God's middle knowledge. He doesn't use the term, obviously. The term middle knowledge isn't in the Bible, just like the term Trinity isn't in the Bible. But the idea of the Trinity seems to be in the Bible, and the idea of middle knowledge, this counterfactual knowledge, this what-if knowledge of what people would freely choose to do if they were in different circumstances, does seem to be a biblical idea, does seem to be something that's taught in the Bible. So here you have Jesus in Matthew 11 talking about how if in different circumstances, if there would have been different circumstances, then these different people would have responded differently. They would have repented. Another example that Molinists point to in the Bible is Acts 17, where Paul says, from one man, he, God, made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and God marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands, and God did this so that they'd seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from any one of us. In other words, it seems as though, according to this, you can take an implication from this that God put different people at different times in history, different locations around the world, so that they would seek him. In other words, he knew what circumstances would, or what people would choose in different circumstances, and he put them in the best circumstances possible so that they would know him and seek him. So this seems to be, for Molinists, another example of this sort of knowledge that God has. And even that God made decisions based on this type of counterfactual middle knowledge. I will say just in history that Molina, who's most well known for this position, developed it in response to the Dominicans, another Catholic group. And the Dominicans within Catholicism, at least at that time in the 1500s, were compatibilists, like John Calvin, like Augustine. they rejected libertarian free will. And so within the Catholic Church, Molina was arguing against compatibilists within the Catholic Church and affirming libertarian free will. And this was, according to Molina, a way to affirm libertarian free will, that we're the cause of our choices, and God's sovereignty, control of all things, down to the most minutiae of detail. Because he would put people in the circumstances to accomplish the things that God wanted to accomplish, knowing how those people would freely, knowing the choices that those individuals would freely make in those circumstances. Again, not that the circumstances caused the decision, the causal agents themselves are the cause of their choices and decisions. But God knows what they would freely choose in different circumstances. So Molina felt these Dominicans, as compatibilists, were making God the cause of evil. And so that was one of the motivations that Molina had in developing this other theological position, if you will. So let's end here talking about some problems with Molinism. This is my position. I'll put my cards out on the table now as we wrap this up. This is my position, but I know that there are issues with it, and there are criticisms of it. So I'll share some of those. So some people would say, even going back to these verses from Matthew 11, well, why would God create people whom he knew would never trust in Jesus? Why would he create people why would God create people that he knew were going to spend eternity in hell? If God knew that those were going to be those individuals' free choices, then why did he create them in the first place? So it doesn't seem to solve all the problems that the Molinist thinks that it solves, in other words. Other critics of this position would say, well, what grounds the truth of these counterfactuals? This would kind of be going back to the open theist, but even compatibilists, and I've even heard this criticism from Thomists who believe that God is timeless, right? They reject Molinism, and one of the reasons they do is they don't think that there's any truth value here for these. It's different than open theism, I guess, because open theism says there's no truth value in future decisions, whereas this criticism says there's no truth value in decisions that will never get made. They're not future, but these counterfactual decisions, this middle knowledge, is knowledge of things that will never happen. You know, I'm never going to be a professional boxer. I'm never going to live in the Middle Ages. So how could God have middle knowledge of what I would choose in those circumstances if those circumstances never come to be? There seems to be no truth value there, or no value for the truth to latch onto, because those circumstances will never exist. So that's another criticism. And another criticism, as you can imagine, is that some people would say it still doesn't affirm the strong sense of sovereignty that some people want to affirm. These individuals just aren't comfortable with any understanding of sovereignty unless God is the cause of all things. And there are some people who just have a really strong view of sovereignty, and for them, even this isn't strong enough. They still don't think God can be in control of the universe. God isn't really sovereign in this situation. So for them, God can only truly be sovereign if he is the cause of all things. They see this as limiting God's power. So, for instance, they would say, let's imagine a situation where I would never choose pink boxing shorts. In any circumstance that God would ever put me in, I, Adam Johnson, would never choose pink boxing shorts. So God would not have the possibility then of creating that actual world where I freely choose pink boxing shorts. And for them, that seems to limit God's power. They feel that that makes God weak or not sovereign or not in control. Now, a Molinist would say, God could force me to choose pink boxing shorts, but then I wouldn't be freely choosing it, right? But so, yes, as a matter of fact, then within Molinism, there are seemingly worlds which are impossible for God to create. So, for example, it would be impossible for God to create a world where I freely choose pink boxing shorts. That would be off the table for God to do. And some people would just not like to limit God in that sense. Okay, well, those are the 5 responses to the problem of free will, and I'll end this lecture here now. And then the next appendix we'll cover is the problem of religious language, and I'll talk more about the syllabus and the class schedule at the end of that lecture.